everyone, today I want to show you how to fix tucked or dropped stitches while your work is still on your machine. When I was first starting out, if I got a tucked stitch or a dropped stitch, I just ripped the whole thing off and started again. But since I've learnt this technique, it's definitely saved me loads of time and wasted work, because I can fix the dropped or tucked stitch while it's on my machine and then just carry on cranking around and not having to start things over and over again. So drop stitches are pretty easy to see when they're on the machine. You'll get a ladder all the way down. Tuck stitches can be a bit tougher, so you can often miss them. But what happens is when your work is done, you get a section here, this is the tucked stitch here, where you get a gap in your work because you haven't got the loop. So you have one loop that essentially covers 2 rows of stitches and it just looks ugly. When you first start out, you can almost mistake it for dodgy tension, but it's definitely a tucked stitch. You can see it in here. You have 2 loops coming instead of just one. So for this tutorial, you're going to need a crochet hook. Actually the old-fashioned metal ones without this rubber grip are better because you can get more ladders onto your needle, but I don't own one. You're going to need a loom pick, and then you are also going to need a stitch marker or something to hold your dropped stitch while you're working around after you've spotted it. So without further ado, let's get going. Now, if you're coming to this tutorial and you have a tucked stitch, you know what it is, you're just wanting to fix it and get on with your work, I've popped some chapters down in the bottom. You can skip this part ahead, but for me it really helped to understand how to spot a tucked stitch and how to stop it happening. So a tucked stitch essentially is when this needle takes not just your working yarn but also the yarn from the loop, from the pins, back inside the machine. So what happens is this loop here doesn't come onto the red pins properly and goes back down in with the working yarn. We can force one by popping this up and then cranking the machine so that it takes both stitches in. So your first point of recognizing that you have a tucked stitch, if you're watching your work as it goes round, is at this point here. On these few stitches, you'll notice that you do not have a loop going round these stitches. That's your first warning sign, you know, your oops, something's happened. With me, I don't bother trying to fix it here. I don't even bother trying to fix it here. Here I forced a drop stitch in the previous round, and you can see that I have here, it's difficult to see on camera, so I have not one loop like on this stitch, but I have 2 loops around these pins. You see? So what's happened is, as the pin has come back out and popped the loops back onto the stitch, it has chucked both loops that were inside the machine back on here. So that's your second sign that you have a tucked stitch. You can fix it here if you want to. I tend not to, because I find them easier to fix once they're a few rows down. Even though it's a bit more work, I find it less fiddly. So I have also popped a few tucked stitches elsewhere in my work. Here you can see what I mean when I say that they're pretty tough to spot when they're on your work. So I would always recommend, as you go round, giving your work a bit of a stretch. So you can see here we have 2 loops, and that's what we want to fix, because that will create that hole when your work is finished, because you have essentially skipped a row. So this, you've got 2 nice stitches either side, and then you've got one big gaping gap here. So that's what we want to fix, and it's actually easier than you might think once you get the hang of it. So we have a tucked stitch here. I put this in earlier. If you can eyeball things, then you can eyeball it or take a note of the pin number. This is pin number 20. If you can't eyeball it, what I do sometimes is you can pop a needle or a stitch marker far enough down so it's out of the way and just mark where your tucked stitch is. So what you want to do is slowly crank until this pin with your tucked stitch lifts up and this yarn starts coming out of the machine. What you want to do then is grab your loom pick, and it does take a bit of work. You can untension your work from underneath the red loops, that does help. And you want to get your loom pick, no, it might feel a bit Counterintuitive, you want to lift your work off the machine like that. With the Sentros, you don't have this big bit of plastic here, so it's much easier to get your loom pick in and to fix the stitch. With the Addi, once your stitch is off, you can just reverse back a little bit, making sure that this loop doesn't fall off, because otherwise you'll end up with another problem. So keep an eye on this stitch. Just make sure that as the pin comes up, the yellow or the whatever colour yarn you're using stays on the 2 pins. You might have to lift it back on with your loom pick. So we have now taken our work off the machine. You can see it's completely released from the machine. And then what you want to do is get your crochet hook and pull out each of the bars of the stitch until you get to your tucked stitch. So here you can see we've got the yellow yarn going through 2 loops of green, and we don't want that. So our last proper stitch is up here. And you want to get your crochet hook and put it under all the bars. This is why I say it's handier if you have one of the old-fashioned crochet hooks that's all metal. So you want it under all of the bars, and in this point you can use your fingers or you can use your loom pick to help. You want to have the loop here at the front. You want to take your first bar, lift it over the loop, and I'm going to use the loom pick just so you can see better, so my hands don't get in the way. Then you want to take the loop that's on the hook, the last worked stitch, not the bar, and lift it over and off the hook. Give it a little tug. Push your work back down a bit so you've got some space to work. Do the same thing again. Lift your next bar over the loop, and then you can use your hand to lift the loop over the hook, and then the bar becomes the next stitch. And you want to do this all the way up, making sure that you haven't got your yarn crossed over. You want them all to go in order, otherwise it will be a mess. And pull through. So again, lift it over, grab the loop with your loom pick or your fingers, whichever you feel more comfortable with, and pull the bar through the loop. Even if you don't know how to crochet, this is really easy. Again, bar over, get the stitch, pull through. These last few ones do get a bit tighter and a little bit tougher. There, once you've done the last one, it's easier to put the stitch onto your loom pick, and then you want to feed that stitch back onto the 2 pins. Tuck everything back under, give it a bit of a stretch, and then when it cranks you want to just hold it on so that it doesn't lift it off. You see, it's all on here. And then we can carry on cranking and it's done. I'll show you another one. So once again, we have a tuck stitch here. We have 2 loops instead of 1 in a stitch, and that's your classic sign of a tucked stitch. So what we want to do is crank until the white pin from the stitch in particular, this is stitch 21, starts to lift up, just so it's far enough that the yarn from inside the machine is coming back up. Again, we want to grab our loom pick and manhandle that stitch off the machine like that, and then again just unpick all of these stitches down to your tucked stitch, which is here. You can see that we have 2 loops in where we should only have 1. Pop your crochet hook underneath your work and pop it into that last stitch, and then again we're just going to work that process of popping each bar over and then pulling the loop over the bar, one at a time. So that we're essentially re-knitting the stitches and getting them ready to go back onto the machine. Just make sure these last two don't get crossed over, because the last two bars can sometimes be quite close together and get crossed over. There, so they're all fixed. Then we want to get our loom pick. Now, unlike the first stitch that I showed you that I fixed, the benefit of having this pin already partially out is that when we fix the stitch back onto the pin, we just want to lift it back over with the loom pick and push it down so that it goes over the two red pins. The benefit of doing that is that when you carry on cranking, you don't have to worry about your white needle pulling the stitch back off again. So in my first stitch that I showed you, I worked it when the needle wasn't quite all the way out, so when I cranked it, it lifted or wanted to lift the stitch back off again, and that would have ended up with the dropped stitch. So you just need to make sure that it always sticks back onto those two red pins, and then you should be good to go. And that is how you fix a tuck stitch. Now, a drop stitch happens when one of your needles, for whatever reason, does not knit a stitch. So the yarn will fall behind the needle and the needle will not take, or the yarn will flick off the needle because your tension's too loose, and again the stitch will not take. So here I'm forcing a drop stitch. I haven't put any yarn underneath here to knit, and that in turn will drop a stitch, but you won't notice it until I've knit a couple more rounds. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then I'll show you again how you fix it. The process is exactly the same. So I'm just going to stop here and show you. You can, if you're beady-eyed, you can see that something doesn't quite look right about this stitch. This is our dropped stitch, and if we left it, if we carried on knitting, when you take your work off your loom and you stretch it out, you're going to end up with a nasty ladder. And you can fix those off the machine, but they're quite time consuming because you would have to re-knit the whole tube. So unlike with a tuck stitch, this will keep unraveling as it goes around. So to prevent too many unravels, what you want to do is you want to go into the last hole stitch, and you want to put something to protect that loop. You can use a stitch marker, or like me, if you don't have one or you can't find any of them, you can use a needle to hold it, and just tuck it out the way so that it's not going to catch on your work as it goes around. And then what you want to do is, again, you want to knit around to this point here, because we always fix our tucked and drop stitches in this area here just before the row comes round to the beginning again. So I'll crank round and I'll show you one last time how to fix these. So here we are, we're back round to the end of the round, and we're going to just crank a little bit more until this needle here on our offending stitch brings the piece of yarn up and back out of the machine. You want to get your loom pick, and as you would with a tucked stitch, you might have to, you want to lift it up and over the white pin. Then make sure all your bars are in order. You want to stretch them out and make sure that your ladder is nice and even, because otherwise when you re-stitch the stitches, you'll cause more problems because they won't be re-stitched in order. So you want to pop your crochet hook in again under those bars. Take your needle out of your dropped stitch, but hold on to that stitch with dear life. You do not want to drop that, because your ladder would whip down pretty quickly if you do not save that stitch. So we have the stitch, and then the process is exactly the same as it would be for a tuck stitch. You want to pop one at a time, a bar over, lift the loop over the bar, and it will knit the stitch for you. One bar over, lift the loop over the bar, and you're creating your lovely new knit stitches. Just going to use my loom pick so you can see, because my hand keeps getting in the way. So you want to lift the bar over. These last few can get a bit tight and not want to behave, so lift it over. You can hold it in place with your finger, grab the loop and pull it over the hook. And the last two, just make sure they don't cross over because they have a slight habit of crossing over. You want to make sure those ladders are in order. So once you have all of your loops back on your crochet hook, you want to make sure that you tuck your work back underneath those two red bumps to put your tension back on the machine, and then you can work the stitch back onto the machine. There, give everything a stretch out, and you can see that you can't even tell that I have manually gone in and fixed that stitch. And that essentially is how you fix tucked and drop stitches while they're on your machine. I hope it saves you lots of time and gives you confidence to fix mistakes while they're still on the machine, and I'll see you again for another tutorial soon. Bye!